You know what? I love fighting games, and one thing I loved doing since I was really young was making fighting game rosters. So when thinking of a new series to start, I thought back to my days with my siblings about coming up with different fighting game rosters, namely Super Smash Bros. But we have made a few different fighting game rosters in the past as well. So what better idea than making a new series about making dream rosters for different fighting game ideas, a series that I like to call Build a Roster, named after Build-A-Bear, obviously. In this series, I'll make up a hypothetical fighting game idea, or take an existing fighting game and make a sequel to it, where I create a hypothetical roster while also creating other aspects of the game in a way to please the fans, but also to be somewhat realistic when coming up with a fighting game roster. Now, that's a great idea and all, but what game should I do first? Well, obviously, if you're watching this video, you know I eventually chose one, but it was all about how I went about choosing it. I could have done Super Smash Bros., but I thought if I'm going to do a crossover fighting game, what better way to start than with the poster child of crossover fighting games, Marvel vs. Capcom. Now, Marvel vs. Capcom has had a pretty strange history over the years, starting as a game for the original PlayStation called X-Men vs. Street Fighter, before evolving over time to Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter. However, even that just eventually became the very first Marvel vs. Capcom, before then moving on to Marvel vs. Capcom 2, and then 3, and then we got the black sheep of the series, Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, which wasn't received very well. But it did try matching the success of the movies by making the roster based around the movie characters, as well as removing one of the team members in place of choosing an Infinity Stone instead, which actually wasn't a bad idea. In fact, I actually thought that was a pretty fun idea. But it also removed the X-Men and other characters who weren't a part of the MCU at the time, despite the fact that the game saw its success through the X-Men. So this time around, we'll call the game Marvel vs. Capcom 4, remove the Infinity Stone mechanic, and bring back the X-Men, as well as open the door for other characters from Marvel and Capcom's arsenal to be a part of the franchise, so that way Infinite can be considered an experimental game in the series, and we can make a great Marvel vs. Capcom game once more. But now that we have all that decided, how many characters will be in the base roster? I'd love to pull a Super Smash Bros. And just say that everybody is here, but that's too unrealistic. So in past games, aside from Infinite's roster of 36, typically see roster sizes from 45 to 50. So let's say to round out the roster and make it even on both sides, we'll say a nice 48 numbers, 24 Marvel characters and 24 Capcom characters. But to take this a step further, I want to introduce new characters to the franchise. But how many new characters? Well, I want to have the staples of the series return. So let's say for each side we get 8 new characters, meaning 16 characters in total of the 48 characters will be brand new to the franchise. And only 32 characters will be returning characters, including the X-Men characters. So let's start this by introducing the returning characters, starting with Marvel, then moving on to Capcom. Then, when we introduce the new characters, we'll start with one Marvel character, then one Capcom character, alternating between the two in alphabetical order. So, now that we have this long-winded opening done, let's get to what you guys want to see, the character roster, starting with the returning characters. Alright, let's start with the Marvel characters. When compiling these characters, I had to decide which characters were popular, not just in the live-action movies, but also in the comics. So be warned, some of the characters ended up getting cut due to lack of popularity between both forms of media. So right off the bat, I get these out of the way. Captain America, Iron Man, Thor, Hulk, and Spider-Man. They're staples of the original games. They're the titular characters to not only the Avengers comics and the Marvel vs. Capcom games, but also to the movies, so it only makes sense to put them in. They don't even need to be changed much either. All you have to do is update their looks to modern graphics and you should be good to go. Though if I had to update any of them, maybe update Spidey with some new gadgets, and maybe change Hulk's level 3 super to be Titan Hulk from the newer comics, but other than that, I think they're good to go. Next, let's bring back some of the X-Men characters who got the axe from Infinite. Obviously, we need to bring back Wolverine. He's been the face of previous Marvel vs. Capcom games, and it would be criminal not to have him return. Of course, if you're going to bring back X-Men, you need Deadpool. In case you haven't been on the internet lately, he's kind of a big deal. And with Deadpool 3 bringing back Wolverine, you need them both back to make this game shine. Next, we of course need some villains, and Magneto is the best X-Men villain you can ask for. Finally, for returning X-Men characters, I think Storm is a good choice. People love her character, and she's popular in both the movies and in the comics. Next up, Hawkeye will be returning alongside Black Widow. I wanted Black Widow in here because she only ever appeared in one game, and unfortunately, that game was Infinite. But you can't have Black Widow without Hawkeye. Next is another fan favorite character similar to Deadpool, and that is Taskmaster. He was a fun smack-talking character, and we definitely want to include some more villains in this. The next three characters will be Doctor Strange, Venom, and Ghost Rider, all popular characters from the previous games and comics. Finally, for returning Marvel characters, we have to include Black Panther. It was really cool to include him in Infinite, however, he only really played like a Wolverine clone. So for this game, he's going to be getting a bit of a rework, incorporating his suit abilities to absorb kinetic energy to knock back into his opponents, maybe include the Dora Milaje into his supers, and even having some specials where he incorporates the previous Black Panther spirits. There is a lot you can do with this character. Okay, now let's get into the Capcom returning characters, starting with the poster child for this game, Ryu. But he won't be alone from Street Fighter, because Chun-Li will also be making a return, and we don't even have to change them much. In fact, we can keep Ryu's special where he uses his Satsui no Hado and Muno Ken. Next, let's get into Capcom's second biggest series, Mega Man. So, I was debating on whether or not to include X or the OG Blue Bomber, but given a few factors, I decided on X. Mega Man has been in a few other games before, and X has only ever been in Infinite, so I felt it appropriate to give him another shot. He was fun to play as, and honestly, if we plan on doing a story mode again, it would make sense given the other character to be included on this list, Zero. Yes, Zero is returning as well. He's just too iconic to not include. We would also have to bring back Tron Bonne, since she is a fan favorite among the Mega Man fans. Next, we of course have to include Dante from Devil May Cry. He's been a staple of Marvel vs. Capcom since 3, and he's been popularized even more thanks to Devil May Cry 5, so because of that, we will be updating his arsenal just a bit. Typically, he is seen in his DMC3 attire and weapons, but this time around, he'll be in his DMC5 attire, and sporting his weapons and powers from that game. We'll also have to update his supers to include his new Devil Trigger look, as well as have his level 3 super be his Sin Devil Trigger. He can also have his Rebellion as his main weapon, but by using his level 2 super, he can have it become the Devil Sword Dante for a short while. While we're on the subject of Devil May Cry, let's bring back Virgil into the mix as well and update his look to Devil May Cry 5 as well, which wouldn't change his arsenal much, but it would change his Force Edge to the Mirage Edge, and it would include his Sin Devil Trigger as well as his Doppelganger mechanic. But overall, he really doesn't change much. These next few I'm going to speed run past because they're iconic and honestly they don't need to change. Morrigan, Strider, Amaterasu, Wesker, Nemesis, and Phoenix Wright will all be returning and be unchanged. I also decided to have Jedha return. We need more villains included in this game, and although Jedha was an Infinite, like X, I feel he deserves another shot at being in the roster. The next returning character is Monster Hunter, but we will be updating them slightly. For the most part, they're just a person with a big sword, and honestly, I feel like we can do better. I don't know much about Monster Hunter personally, but friends of mine have suggested ideas to me to make them better, like including more weapons, and even including more monsters in their supers. On top of that, we can have better costumes that reflect both the male and female forms, as well as other forms of armor to spice things up. Finally, I wanted to reach back and include characters from past games that fans seemed to want to have return, and the most popular among them was a character called Captain Commando. He was the face of earlier Marvel vs. Capcom games, and kind of an odd pick, which is something people love about this series. All we'd have to do really is to update his looks for a modern design, and maybe update some moves, but overall he's ready to go. Alright, that's it for the returning cast, but I know what you're probably more excited for, and that's the newcomers. So let's get into it with the brand new characters of the series. Alright, so to introduce the newcomers, we will start with one Marvel character, then one Capcom character, going in alphabetical order, alternating between them until we finish the newcomer list. So let's start with the first Marvel newcomer. Blade. That's right, we're starting with the Daywalker himself. Blade is a pretty popular character, and he has been highly suggested for this game for a long time. He was even a household name for a while thanks to his movies being the first successful Marvel movie, before being sidelined by Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy. Blade could be a distance gimmick fighter, like throwing items, his katana, and of course he could use moves that has him drink blood of his opponent to gain back his life bar. Either way, Blade would be an excellent addition to Marvel vs. Capcom.
Get ready for the fight of your life!
Ashura from Ashura's Wrath. So, I'm gonna be honest, this was a character I didn't know much about, but seeing gameplay for this game, I had to try it for myself, and I'm glad I did. Ashura's Wrath was an amazing game. He unfortunately came out after Marvel vs. Capcom 3, so he missed the cut for that game. But people were hoping he'd be in Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, but missed the cut for that game as well. So honestly, we need to correct that, especially since he's one of Capcom's most powerful characters, and it would be a cool matchup against somebody like the Hulk. The gameplay of Ashura's Wrath boils down to building up a burst meter with your attacks, as well as quick time events to attack multiple times in a row. So for this game, I can see Ashura being a Rekka fighter. For those who don't know what this is, they're basically combo fighters. I won't go into too much detail in terms of gameplay for him, because you can do so much with this character. Ashura would be a great addition to this game.
Get ready for the fight of your life!
I wanted to make this city something better than it is. Something beautiful. You took that away from me! You took everything! I'm gonna kill you! Take your shot.
Daredevil. At this point, including Daredevil is a no-brainer. Daredevil has quickly become a household name now, thanks to Netflix's own Daredevil TV show with Charlie Cox, who, by the way, played an amazing version of Daredevil. So if they made this game, they should cast him to be his voice. I know it might be a bit weird to switch from normal acting to voice acting, but it's not like it's something he's incapable of doing. I mean, he is voicing Daredevil in the upcoming Spider-Man project that Disney Plus has cooking up. You know he's committed to that role when that project doesn't even have Tom Holland voicing Spider-Man, but Charlie Cox is still willing to come back and voice Daredevil. Anyways, in terms of gameplay, Daredevil would be a hand-to-hand fighter, but he could also work well as a grappler, since his martial arts has a lot of grabbing and tossing of the opponent. However, he could also have a counter gimmick to reflect the fact that he can see moves coming thanks to his echolocation. He could also have a super where it goes into an animation that has the lights go out before the opponent gets hit with a barrage of attacks, to reference the fact that his blindness gives him an advantage in the dark. Give him his retractable billy club and he's ready to go. Regardless of how they do it, this character needs to be included.
Get ready for the fight of your life!
Mysterious, arrogant, powerful. There is no word that better describes him than hungry. Once the high noble of the demon world, he was exiled for challenging its ruler, Belial Ainsland. And having spent a century licking his wounds in the human-infested world called Earth, he is hungry for revenge.
Dimitri from Darkstalkers. We definitely needed more characters from the Darkstalkers franchise, and looking for the characters who would have cool interactions, are fan favorites, and have been requested for past games, two characters have come to mind, and Dimitri was one of them. Since he's from a fighting game, you really don't have to do much for this character. Just try and make his moveset as close to a one-to-one match as possible, and you should be good. I'm mostly excited for the story potential between Dimitri and Blade, as well as other potential monsters and supernatural hunters.
Get ready for the fight of your life!
Loki. Okay, so we definitely needed more major villains for this game. But even more than that, we needed a main antagonist for this game. And what better antagonist to use than the god of mischief himself? Loki has been a major villain for the Avengers in the comics for a long time. So much so that the first Avengers movie had him as the main villain. I'll go more into how he'll play into the main story later, but for now, how would Loki play? Well, I can imagine him using a lot of illusions, maybe utilizing his staff as well, and perhaps even using some ice moves given his frost giant heritage. He'd most likely be a gimmick fighter, and that just fits Loki perfectly.
Get ready for the fight of your life!
Edward Falcon from Power Stone. Power Stone is quite an obscure game, but honestly, that's what Marvel vs. Capcom is known for. Plus, he'd be perfect for a game that has people looking for powerful stones, and I can see Loki trying to use them and finding that they are similar to the Infinity Stones. See, Power Stone is a fighting game that has you collecting colored gems as you fight to gain power, which sounds exactly what people do in Marvel for the Infinity Stones. As for how he'd fight, I could see him being a hand-to-hand fighter, but with a twist. Give him a power gem meter that fills up the more he hits the opponent, and depletes the more he gets hit without hitting the opponent. The higher the meter, the more damage he does, and when it's full, he can go into his super form. He can also use his super meter to fill up one gem slot, and even fill them all up if he has a level 3 super. Beyond that, I can also see him using certain items that he finds in his original game. There is a lot you can do with Edward Falcon.
Get ready for the fight of your life.
When do I know I'm Spider-Man? You won't. That's all it is, Miles. A leap of faith.
Like, what's up, danger? Like, what's up, danger? Like, what's up, danger?
Miles Morales. Miles has been gaining popularity quickly over the years thanks to the success of the Into the Spider-Verse movie he starred in. Before that, he was pretty damn obscure, but now he even has his own Spider-Man video game and will appear in the Spider-Man video game sequel. He can play similarly to Spider-Man, but because he's not as experienced, have that be reflected in his moveset. He won't punch as hard or be as fast, but he can make up for that with his lightning attacks, and he could even have the ability to turn invisible, only to attack the opponent from behind. Give him some unique supers from Spider-Man, and boom, Miles is good to go.
Get ready for the fight of your life.
The curse of the werewolf can turn a man into a pitiful creature, unable to control their own actions, their own fate. But not this man. His pride led him to train in the martial arts, to perfect his fighting, to go beyond his limits, and regain control over his destiny, his life.
Jontel Bane from Darkstalkers. Our second newcomer from the Darkstalkers franchise is Jontel Bane. He's a pretty popular character, and I'm surprised it's taken this long for him to be included. Again, being from a fighting game like Dimitri and Morgan, you can just adapt his original moveset. It would be fun to see a character interact with other monsters and monster hunters, just like Dimitri from earlier.
Get ready for the fight of your life.
Okay, for this next character, we obviously needed a character from a certain team, and given that this would be the official 4th game in the Marvel vs. Capcom franchise, who best to include other than a Fantastic Four character? But who would be the best to include? Well, after much deliberation, I went with...
And the smartest man alive, Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four. Hello, Stephen.
Mr. Fantastic. Okay, so I wanted to include a Fantastic Four rep, but I struggled as to who to include as the first one. The Human Torch felt like too much of a Nova or Phoenix type character, the Thing felt like too much of like the Hulk, and I struggled to find a good way to incorporate an Invisible Woman moveset. But Mr. Fantastic felt unique from the rest. Plus, he's the leader, so it only made sense to me. Yes, he can stretch, and it would kind of feel unfair to have a character like that in a fighting game, but plenty of other fighting games have had far-reaching characters before. Plus, he wouldn't be very strong, and that wouldn't be his only set of moves he can use. He is a super genius, so perhaps he could also use certain types of technology to fight with as well. Plus, if his attacks missed, it would leave him very wide open for an attack, as he'd have to have cooldown between each stretched attacks. He'd be one of the most unique fighters I've seen in Marvel vs. Capcom to date.
Get ready for the fight of your life.
Well then, where do you want me to break you first?
Jury from Street Fighter. I was tempted to either use Blanca or Sagat in here, since they are fan favorites, but we need some new blood, and Jury from Street Fighter V is one of the new characters people seemed to really love, so I feel like this would be a great inclusion to the roster. And, much like all the other fighting game characters, all you'd have to do is incorporate her moveset 1-to-1, and she's good to go.
Get ready for the fight of your life.
So I felt as though we could have included some more unique and different fighters from the X-Men side of Marvel. So I decided to go with... Nightcrawler. I could see his teleportation being implemented into his movesets as well as his acrobatics. Seeing him interact with monsters who think that he is one of them, and him saying, "What do you mean? I'm a human too. I just mutated a little bit." It would be really fun to see. I feel as though Nightcrawler is a unique choice to the Marvel vs. Capcom franchise. He's a fan favorite among the X-Men characters, and he just seems like it'd be a really cool inclusion. So I decided to go with Nightcrawler because I felt like he'd be a really cool inclusion to the franchise.
Get ready for the fight of your life.
I found it.
Lady from Devil May Cry. We definitely need to include her. So far we've had Dante, Virgil, and even Trish show up in Marvel vs. Capcom in the past, but Lady doesn't get enough love. Hell, she was only ever playable in DMC4, so maybe just update her look to be from Devil May Cry 5, but give her the same moveset from 4 and perhaps update it just slightly. Include some handguns, shotguns, TMPs, explosive mines that she can send onto the ground, and of course, her famous Kalina Ann, but have it updated to be the Kalina Ann 2. Maybe even have her use her grappling hook on the end of her rocket launcher to pull in enemies. Her level 3 super can even be her special move that she did in the cutscene of Devil May Cry 3. This one right here. I'm just saying, there's a lot you can do with Lady.
Get ready for the fight of your life.
Punisher. We can't talk about Mercenaries without having the famous Punisher. Punisher, much like Daredevil, has been getting a lot more traction recently thanks to their Netflix series with Charlie Cox and Jon Bernthal. Punisher could play similarly to someone like Chris Redfield, but with more aggression to his attacks. Something Punisher is famous for is using more than just shotguns to his moveset. He's an excellent hand-to-hand fighter, and is great at utilizing melee weapons to his attacks, as well as using the environment. Plus, you can't forget his famous minigun that he carries around with him. Maybe even have his level 3 super be his motorcycle with attached minigun. Regardless, there's a lot you can do with Punisher. He's an amazing character and a fan favorite among Marvel fans.
Get ready for the fight of your life.
Now, we of course need to include a Resident Evil rep, since I didn't include Chris Redfield this time around. However, I thought this would be a great opportunity to include a Resident Evil character that fans have been asking for a long time.
Didn't I teach you? Knives are faster.
Leon Kennedy from Resident Evil 4. This version of Leon will specifically be from the new Resident Evil 4 remake. You of course can include moves that has him using his handgun, shotgun, TMP, etc. He could also include his flash grenades, his knife, and even utilize Ashley to throw him items like herbs to heal you. One of his supers can be fighting alongside Louise and even using the red grenade launcher. He can even pull a Frank West and throw some of the Ganado villagers at him. Regardless, Leon needs to be included in this game.
Get ready for the fight of your life.
So we've had a few Guardians of the Galaxy members in previous Marvel vs. Capcom games, but only Gamora, Rocket Raccoon, and Groot. So of course, if we're going to include a new Guardians of the Galaxy character, it has to be
Star-Lord.
Who?
Star-Lord, man. Legendary outlaw.
Star-Lord. I'm honestly kind of surprised he wasn't included in the last game, because Star-Lord is their leader. He could obviously utilize his laser pistols, but you can also utilize some of his power sets used in the Guardians of the Galaxy video game that came out a couple of years ago. His supers can include such powers like using his blasters, having the ice shot, wind shot, lightning shot, and plasma shot. He can even have a level 3 super where he pulls in the rest of the members of the Guardians of the Galaxy to come and join him and do an ultimate attack against the enemy. Honestly, it's an easy inclusion.
Get ready for the fight of your life.
Last but not least, we need to round up the Devil May Cry roster by including
Sorry, Dante. I'm back in this bitch.
Nero. Nero has been a complicated character among the DMC fandom with his out-of-nowhere inclusion during DMC 4. He wasn't very popular then, but thanks to DMC 5, fans have finally accepted him as one of the mainstays of the series. With that, how to best include him into Marvel vs. Capcom? Well, you can obviously have him utilize his look in DMC 5, just like everybody else. He can use his Red Queen sword, which he can use to rev up in order to increase his damage output. He can use his Blue Rose pistol, which he can use to penetrate enemies' defenses. Of course, he could also have a revolving door of different Devil Breakers that he can switch between at will, with the Overture, of course, being his default. Now, if we're talking supers, his level 2 super can have him using the ultimate ability of whatever Devil Breaker he has equipped at the moment, and one of his supers obviously has to be his newly added Devil Trigger. So that was the character roster. But I'm going all out with this video, and what would complete this game more than the second most important factor to a fighting game roster, that being their stages. Now, stages are great, but Marvel vs. Capcom has never really been great at making stages for its crossover games. So I'm going to try my best to step it up slightly when it comes to the stages. They never had many stages in the games either, so I'll keep that theme going as well. Not every game can be like Super Smash Bros. And include 100 stages or more, so I'll figure I'll include 20 stages, 10 for Marvel and 10 for Capcom. Though I'm not doing much in terms of quantity, but I will be making up for it and bump up the quality of the stages. Most of the time, the stages in Marvel vs. Capcom games are pretty lackluster, and even in Marvel vs. Capcom 3, when they had stages that actually showcased the world in which they both live, it still was pretty underwhelming. So I plan to bring it up a notch and show how both worlds are actually merged. Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, oddly enough, came the closest to this idea, but it ended up being too merged to the point of almost parody. Some of the merged names were cool, like Marvel's AIM Laboratory being merged with Umbrella to become AIMbrella, but others were pretty poor, like Valconda. So we're gonna correct that here. We'll have the normal worlds that each series comes from, but if the places is close enough to another series, they'll have characters show up from their series as little things that go on in the background. You'll see what I'm talking about when I get into it, so without further ado, let's get into the stages in the same way I've been doing it before, alternating between Marvel and Capcom in alphabetical order. First up, on the Marvel side, Asgard will be back in all of its mythological Bifrost Bridge glory. However, we will also have some characters show up in the background as well, who may not be a part of the roster yet, but will still be included in the game to wrap more Marvel and even Capcom characters. We can have Odin and the Frost Giants show up at some point, before having Yomigami, the brush god of rejuvenation from the game Okami, show up alongside Amaterasu's son, Chibi-Terasu. I think it's a cool way to rep different gods in Asgard from Capcom. First up, on the Capcom side of things, is Able City from Mega Man X. This will be an outside shot near Dr. Light's lab, showcasing Dr. Light interacting with Mega Man Volnut from the Mega Man Legends series. However, eventually, Ultron bots come raining down the city, while other bots like Proto Man and Base come in to stop Ultron. We can possibly even include some Sentinel bots in there as well. There's no such thing as too many robots fighting each other, especially in Able City. Back to the Marvel side of stages, we have AIM Laboratory. Here we have the classic MODOK hanging out in the background yelling at the people fighting in front of him. However, Chris Redfield and Claire Redfield break into the labs to stop MODOK before he sends in the android Cash and the enhanced soldier Krauser from Resident Evil 4. There, they'll have an all-out battle with each other in the background. I thought this would have been a cool way to keep the idea of having Umbrella and AIM together. Having them fight in the background could be a little distracting, but I still think it's a cool idea to have. Next, heading back over to Capcom, we have the Monster Hunter world of Astera. Obviously, we can have Rathalos showing up, but he won't be the only giant beast to show up here. We need the dragon from Marvel, none other than Fin Fang Foom. They fight for a bit before being hunted by random monster hunters showing up in the background. Not much really to go on here, it's just a lot of dragon on dragon battles. Now, of course, we have to include Avengers Tower. Now, who would we include in the Avengers Tower? Well, no one or two character in particular come to mind, so we could just include various Marvel and Capcom heroes hanging out inside the tower, but then we could have a few villains break into the tower like Crossbones and Baron Zemo, as well as M. Bison and Dr. Wily from Street Fighter and Mega Man respectively. One of my favorite ideas for a stage due to crossover potentials is the courtroom from Ace Attorney. It could have the Abomination on trial for some crime that he did, while Edgeworth defends him and She-Hulk is against him. And then suddenly, Juggernaut breaks into the courtroom and tries to save Abomination, while Apollo Justice comes in to try and stop him. Again, not really much to go on here, but again, I wanted to include the courtroom scene because of the potential for different crossover potentials. Next up on the Marvel end is the Baxter Building from Fantastic Four. This stage would obviously have to have The Thing, Invisible Woman, and Human Torch sitting inside the building with Spencer, Dr. Light, and Roll before finally being interrupted by Kang the Conqueror and Sigma breaking into the Baxter Building, resulting in a fight between good and evil. I know, it's a bit straightforward, but you'll see a theme going on with all of my different stages. Next up is the Devil May Cry shop from the game Devil May Cry. Here, we'll have Morrison, Nico, and V hanging out in the shop when Elsa Bloodstone comes in giving a job request to Morrison, but being interrupted by an attack by Lilith and Mephisto, before Elsa and V start fighting them and destroying the shop. I found this to be a pretty funny callback to Devil May Cry 3 when Dante's entire shop got obliterated by demons. Heading back over to the Marvel side is the Helicarrier, but this time it's going to be flying through the air rather than just staying stagnant like in Marvel vs. Capcom 3. Here we'll have Maria Hill and Nick Fury showing Guile and Jill Valentine around the carrier, when suddenly they're attacked by members of Shadowloo, a terrorist organization from Street Fighter. This would have wreckage ensue in the background. Not much for this, it's pretty straightforward. Next up for the Capcom side, it's Echo Ridge from Mega Man Star Force. This stage would have Geo, Mega Man.exe, and Vision walking around Echo Ridge before being attacked by the different villains from Mega Man Star Force. The place would then change to be just like the digital world within Echo Ridge, creating more chaos, but also opportunities for some of Geo's allies to show up and join the fight. Coming back to the Marvel side, we got Doctor Strange's Sanctum Sanctorum. Inside you'll see Wong taking care of a few duties. With Wong, you will also see Scarlet Witch hanging out with Tessa from the game Red Earth, teaching her some magic. Suddenly, they'll be attacked by Mordo and Fao Lu from the game Breath of Fire, and they'll break in and attack the Sanctorum, resulting in a fight between magic users. Next up, with Capcom, we have Makai. Makai is the Dark Kingdom from the game Darkstalkers, and here is where we'll see different monsters from Darkstalkers, as well as Firebrand and Lilith. Next up, we'll see Dormammu and Blackheart hanging around the Dark Realm. Here, I couldn't really think of any sort of fights that could ensue, so I'll just have it to where the other Darkstalkers are fighting each other in the background. Another really fun stage idea I came up with is the Nelson and Murdoch building. This one also wouldn't have any real fighting in it, it would just be inside the office building where Foggy, Nelson, and Karen Page are hanging out in the building with Mai Fei and Apollo Justice from the Ace Attorney franchise. This would mostly just be a chill stage to be on. Next up, we have Metro City from the game Final Fight. Here, we can have the Mad Gear Gang walking around the city before being attacked by the Sinister Six and simultaneously trying to fight off Mike Hagar, Luke Cage, and Jessica Jones. Nothing too crazy, just a straight-to-the-point street fight. Next up is the skull floating in space known as Nowhere, where we can have Drax hanging out with the Ravagers, before random characters from the game Space Channel 5 just walk in frame and start randomly dancing. For those who don't know, Space Channel 5 is a dancing game made by Capcom. They will eventually be interrupted by Galactus showing up in the background and laughing menacingly. That's about it. Capcom, oddly enough, doesn't really have space-themed games, so it was really hard to pick anything from Capcom. So I just decided to go with Space Channel 5. Next is the Land of the Rising Sun, Nippon from Okami. Here we'll have a few of the brush gods in the background like Tachigami and Hanagami, and a few others walking around in the background. However, we can then have Zeus and Hercules show up in the background interacting with the many brush gods, before finally, Gore the God Butcher shows up and starts attacking the many gods, starting a big fight in the background. Next up, we finally get to Wakanda, the stage everybody truly wanted to see in Infinite. This would have the palace of Wakanda in the background with Shuri and the Dora Milaje alongside Felicia from Darkstalkers and Leo from the game Red Earth. Eventually, we could also see some Palicos from Monster Hunter Rise. They would just be hanging out in the background, nothing too crazy, maybe have Killmonger show up as well to cause some terror. Next up is Salazar's Castle from Resident Evil 4. We would obviously have Ramon Salazar fighting against a few creatures of the night like Morbius and Werewolf by Night and maybe even Man-Thing. But you would also have Arthur showing up and maybe even Kenji from Red Earth. This place would be dark and creepy with some of the Ganado showing up as well. Next up we can have Xavier Mansion. Xavier Mansion is an easy stage for them to have crossover potential. It would obviously have Professor X and the other members of the X-Men, but also we could have a school bus show up with the different characters from Capcom's Rival Schools game. They mostly just been hanging out, but we can also have some characters sparring in the background. This is a great opportunity to have two different franchises that has a school aesthetic come together and fight each other. And finally, we get to the final stage of the game, the World Warrior Tournament from Street Fighter. Here you can have members of Street Fighter who aren't playable yet, like Fei Long or Blanca, but you could also have Shang-Chi from Marvel, as well as Iron Fist. We can have all of these characters come together and fight each other, just like how you would see in Street Fighter. So you'll probably notice that there was a theme that I used to structure these backgrounds, where there's always a fight between similar powered characters, and they can be a bit distracting, especially if you play the game competitively. But there can be an option to turn off these events in the background in case people don't want them. So there you have it, 20 stages, 48 characters, 16 of which being brand new to the franchise. You couldn't ask for more. Unless the game did really, really well. So what if, hypothetically, this game did so well that they decided to include some DLC content? Well, that's where I decided to do just that. However, that will have to be for a part 2, because this video is already running pretty long. Now, you also may be wondering, what if any of the characters that showed up in the stage portion would be DLC? And it's possible, so if that were to be the case, they just wouldn't show up in the background. But for this part 2, I will also talk about other aspects of the game, such as DLC, game modes, and other small details I had in mind for the game's small quality of life stuff, as well as discuss potential story for the game. So if you want to see that, let me know in the comments below and leave a like. Also tell me who you want to see for the DLC. Anyways, that's really all I got for this part, so check in next time for part 2, and I'll work on that video as soon as possible. Leave me all your thoughts in the comments below. Please like and consider subscribing for more if you guys enjoyed, and hit that notification bell for more videos like this. Also, check out my socials in the description, as well as checking out my brand new Patreon if you guys want to support me further. And until next time guys, stay hype, stay awesome, stay weird, and be nice to each other. I'm Cybertech Werewolf, and I'll see you guys next time.